Hi, welcome to Against All Odds. I'm your host, David Smithy.
And I'm your host, Erik Lukow. Welcome today. We are just getting back to you with our second episode. We'd like to talk about Ukraine again and the war going on there, but we'd like to talk about it in a broader context today. Let me first explain what Against All Odds is. We're really just a show, two guys, average people. We've had a little bit of experience, David Smithy and myself, around the world doing different things in our careers, and I'm sure that'll come out through different broadcasts. But we're really just trying not to be experts. Frankly, we've had our fill of experts. We're really just trying to be average guys, trying to grapple with what's going on in the world and how that impacts us in our particular stages in life. I'm a single father of four, taking care of kids who are in middle school and high school, and Dave is himself married and on the way, I think to semi-retired, right, Dave?
Yeah, and out here in Texas with the grandkids, and just moved here. Well, I mean, since people would know, I used to live in Maui, where you currently reside, and so
That's right.
we
Sad to see
got
you
to know
go.
one another. And so, but made our way through the great state of Utah to the greater state of Texas. And we did that because our children were here and we had grandchildren here. But one of the main reasons above and beyond that was just that we feel that this is a state that really still represents what America is about. And so that's kind of the angle that we and the perspective that we bring to this broadcast, is that we consider ourselves, if nothing else, certainly we're patriots. So, but we like to discuss the issues. We decided when we started this program that we wanted to have an open mind, and we're not representing that we have dogma on any of these issues. And you'll hear that as Erik and I discuss and bring these issues to you, that we don't always agree on things. And ultimately, we'll be adding the ability for people to join our program, because we're interested in learning as much as we are sharing what we know.
Yeah, I think there's been a sort of push towards autocracy in our culture in America here. As you point out, Texas is seen as, more representative of what the United States used to be, particular stress on the First Amendment, the ability to share your thoughts and ideas, even if people don't agree. And I think that's what's really changed in our culture lately. And I don't think it's changed completely in the full culture of America. I think there's a very vocal group, the woke crowd, who are pushing back on the idea that you might even, within your First Amendment rights, say something that's offensive to another individual. And that's the whole point of the First Amendment, is let's get the words out before people get violent. I think the idea of the First Amendment is the more we talk about ideas, the more we share our ideas, even diametrically opposed ideas. Even somebody coming on the program saying, I hate you, Erik, and I hate your idea. It's better for them to be on the program where I can say, well, why is that? And let's talk about it and let's discuss. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you could try to educate me and I will try to educate you, but we have, civility and respect. And I think you'll find that that's the approach that we're trying to take with Against All Odds. And that's why, by the way, we call it Against All Odds, because in our culture today, it doesn't seem like anyone's really open to the idea that you would be able to express yourself freely and walk away, maybe even agreeing to disagree, shake hands and not resort to violence. And we saw, the last couple of summers, quite a bit of violence in the cities as people were arguing for defunding the police, and a lot of equity issues were raised, and we saw people resorting to trashing stores, burning things, killing each other, and that's what you want to avoid, and that's what the First Amendment is designed to avoid. Let's talk it out rather than fighting it out.
And I like that you brought up before that the First Amendment, really the right to free speech, if you limit that, you're really limiting people's right to free thought, because if you can't express what you're thinking, then you've substantially have just pretty much impaired people's ability to think freely just by limiting their speech. And it's an interesting point, because even as we see the riots that have occurred over the last summer in the United States, we also saw a lot of riots occurring globally. Let's not call it riots. Actually, I'd rather say protests, because they were mostly peaceful protests.
Yeah, mostly.
And
but I think there was a large peaceful component in all the protests, absolutely. But I think there's a group, particularly in the United States, and I can't speak for elsewhere, but there's always a tendency when a large crowd gathers that there can be a group that can co-opt the movement and start violence, maybe in some small corner of it, and then incite others who normally wouldn't go that direction toward violence. But at least from my point of view, what I saw on television last couple of summers was very violent. And we even had some commentators, and Chris Cuomo said, where does it say that protests have to be peaceful? and that they have to be organized, and not filled with chaos. And I thought to myself, wow, that I think when you look at leaders like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who did promote civil disobedience, their key point was, let's be peaceful about it. We're not the aggressors here. We're
Mhm.
actually standing up for what is morally right and good, and therefore, with the moral right on our side, we don't have to resort to violence. It's typically the person
Yeah.
who does not have the moral right on their side that has to resort to power
And so
tactics. And
let's
so,
let's let's kind of flip this idea of protest, because I was thinking about the protests that were occurring in Europe because of COVID. But now, and through that, we saw a very interesting dynamic where, in I'm going to switch from Europe back to Canada, but we saw some really draconian measures being implemented
mm,
against those people who would protest against wearing a mask. And so
mm,
we saw that in Australia, Austria, and Canada. Canada actually is probably one of the most oppressive governments around protest. And it isn't interesting because against a backdrop, those who would seek to stop the protesting, even by implementing laws against free speech in their own countries, are now coming out in this unity with those and encouraging those who are protesting in Russia against
mm,
Russia's involvement into Ukraine. So I'd like to turn the
mm.
page with you and capture your thoughts about, here we are on March 4th, Friday afternoon, and there's some recent developments that taking place in the region, the area, and I thought that we would probably talk a little bit about that.
Well, I agree with you 100%. It's really hard for somebody like Justin Trudeau in Canada to wax eloquent about, freedom of speech and sort of come down on Putin. I don't know if Putin has enacted the Emergency Powers Act like Justin Trudeau did, but he's certainly cracking down. I think they're saying something like 1,700, maybe 7,000. I can't remember if I get the figure right. Protesters have been incarcerated, have been arrested in Russia for protesting against the Ukraine war, and or incursion, whatever you want, special military action, however you want to deem that. And
Right.
again, where's the moral high ground? I think everyone understood that it was Biden who had called Trudeau and said, you need to crack down on these truckers. And again, they would tell you, well, it's completely different. It's completely different. It's, in this case, it's this horrible act by Putin against his neighbor, and his
Yeah.
own people are standing up against him. But I don't think it's different at all, because ultimately they were protesting what they considered to be horrible restrictions on the people of Canada. It was the truckers saying, you're making it difficult for me to earn a living, and imposing mandates upon me that I don't believe are generally supported by either the science or the populace. And there is debate out there. And the irony was that most of these truckers were vaccinated. I think the number was 70 to 90%.
Right.
But they were willing to stand up for the right of certain of their group to say no and to make their own decision. And again, that's that old Nazi Germany. I don't know whoever said it, but one of the concentration camp survivors said, they come for, me, and, you don't stand up, and they come for your neighbor, you don't stand up, and they come for you. There's no one left to stand up.
Right.
And I think there's a lot of people in the world who are starting to sense this autocracy, and it seems to be around, climate change is a place where people want to say, you have to do it my way.
Hmm.
This vaccination slash pandemic response area, the medical dictates seem to be an area where people say, no, you have to do it my way. And then there's, you can think of other areas where they're moving in the economy to control things, and again, you have to participate my way or the highway, and that's not freedom. And so the irony is that, as we do take a look at what's happening in Russia and Ukraine, I think there is some ambivalence among observers, and they say, on the one hand, yes, it looks like naked aggression from Putin, and it looks like we should stand behind the freedom fighters of Ukraine. But there's a
Hmm.
lot of people sitting back and saying, well, do we really have the moral authority to do that anymore? Because if you're, say, Australia, and you're putting teenage kids in what amount to concentration camps
Right.
because they refuse to get vaccinated, and then when they climb the fence, as any natural born teenager will do, you arrest them and put them in jail. And so for some crime that it's unclear what they committed. And again, it's very easy to interpret the law in a way that allows you to lock people up, and it's very hard then to prove that you have a right to get out. We've seen that in the case of the January 6th, I don't know if you call it again, peaceful protest turned riot at the Capitol building during during President
Oh,
Trump's speech and
you're
the
of
counting
course
of the votes.
referring to the resurrection,
Yeah.
the insurrection. Yeah,
Yeah, the resurrection turned insurrection. But there again, the question is, why are these people still held in jail?
Mhm.
Almost a year later, they're just now receiving sentences. They seem pretty harsh in my mind for some of the things I saw happening. They seem, whether you think they're harsh or lenient, standing on their own. I think the judge is doing a great job of explaining why he's giving these sentences. He's pointing out that we can't have people storming the Capitol if they disagree with the election results. That's a fair statement. That I agree with that. I have
Mhm.
um, zero support for anybody who's going to destroy property or injure life or not obey the instructions of the police. I don't think you should be trespassing.
Let me
Peaceful
jump
protest
in.
is not those things.
Let me jump in with that because some would say that, and I count myself among them, that there are agent provocateurs. I mean, we've really seen this throughout our history, so it's really no surprise. In fact, you could see one such man who was acting as the leader, who it's questionable whether he had FBI connections or not, but he was the strongest voice in the crowd that was leading a lot of the group there that was a peaceful group into the Capitol building. So that wasn't really a spontaneous action. That was really something that was being led. It was being goaded. And it was very clear that there's one man, because he literally stood head and shoulders above the rest. And because in this day of everybody is a citizen journalist, everybody's got a camera, there are a lot of people and a lot of angles that showed this person who was acting as kind of the Lone Ranger, but really was, powerful and persuasive and got people to go inside the Capitol building. So,
And there's no doubt that I want to have a show on that because I
yeah,
think there's a lot, to be said both directions. The point I was simply trying to make in relation to Ukraine was to pick up at what's happening in Canada. I think again very hard for Trudeau or anybody in his government to take the moral high ground against Putin, rounding up
yeah,
his own investors. But I also want to point out here in our own glorious United States of America, you can argue that the judge is doing a good job pointing out that what happened shouldn't have happened, and again it could have been an agent provocateur. I think there's a lot of evidence that something was going on there a lot deeper than people just spontaneously attacking the Capitol. I
mhm,
don't think they had malicious intent because the point I wanted to make was just simply to compare the law enforcement response to the riots that happened the summer previously when George Floyd was unfortunately
right,
murdered basically by that police officer. So there was you look at what happened there. Again, we can have an episode on that as well, but
yeah.
pretty roundly condemned behavior by the police in that instance. I don't think there was anybody saying that that officer hadn't, basically, killed George Floyd, and that there was plenty of reason to indict that man and give him a trial. And eventually he was convicted, and so were all the officers standing around. So
Mhm.
ultimately, justice was done through the justice system. But what I'm pointing out is that you look at the riots that ensued there, and for several other police brutality, incidents that occurred throughout that summer, and you saw people, actually smashing down glass, stealing things, beating people to death. I saw a few videos where it looked like the person had to be dead, the way their limbs were just all in different directions, and the number of people who had kicked them and stomped them and hit them with boards and things. It just looked like they were dead. And I don't hear of any charges in those cases, anybody being arrested. And there's video evidence. So it's not that hard for police to, use face recognition software or witnesses. And, once they get one, they can find out who the rest were there.
Mhm.
It really, the law enforcement response to January 6th versus what happened during what I'll call the George Floyd riots is completely out of balance. And that's the only point I was trying to make. Again,
Yeah.
you can argue
So,
whether somebody should get 70 days or 30 days or whatever for going to the Capitol. There's an argument both ways there, but if it stands alone. But if you look at a summer of rioting that led up to that, that
well,
was
before you go
motivated.
there, let me try to sort of bring this back into focus here. I was only using that example of the agent provocateur, sort of a microscope, into the sort of false flag operations that we're all familiar with. And now to kind of zoom out and then maybe more telescopically look to Ukraine, the question is, has the United States in some ways acted in and a capacity to kind of stir the hornet's nest by sort of maybe being partially at least responsible for maybe provoking some of the actions towards Putin by bringing NATO, bringing the allied forces, bringing the European nation closer to Russian territory. And so
I did have a conversation about that today with my friend who, does have some interaction with Ukraine. He adopted a
yeah,
young lady from there, and he was talking about, not just the fact that, that he definitely, makes that NATO argument, that there is some kind of a tightening noose. And if you look at it historically, he made a point that was great, which is basically that it has been land and distance that has defended Russia. People have the joke that don't attack Russia in winter. Napoleon learned his
right,
lesson. Hitler learned his lesson. These were very successful armies elsewhere in Europe, and then they went into Russia in winter, and both of them got bogged down and destroyed. So having a buffer zone and a distance, between, say, Berlin and Moscow has always been important to their defense, and they don't really have that anymore because Poland is, within NATO. And so, yeah, you can sense that from, a historical standpoint, Putin is not behaving outside of what you would call reasonable norm for a Russian leader. He also pointed out something very interesting that I hadn't put two and two together, but I've heard this before, that I guess Joe Biden as vice president made 12 or 13 trips to the Ukraine.
right.
During his tenure. And again, you would think to yourself, yeah, wow, given the size of Ukraine's economy and their strategic lack of importance really to the United States of America, I don't know, did he make that many trips to China? Did he make that many trips to Great Britain? I don't think so. And so people begin to sort of point out that with the allegations about Hunter Biden and his behavior there, that Ukraine in a sense previously had, I guess, a pro-Russian leader, and was really a satellite state cooperating with Putin. And then there was a lot of people believe CIA-backed
Yeah,
coup that put Zelensky in
Yanakovich, I
place.
think, was the Soviet sympathizer who was ousted, in 2013 and 2014. This was a very, important year as well. But
Yeah, and people believe by really by the CIA, which would be very provocative from Putin's
right,
standpoint. Zelensky's put in place eventually, and becomes what people believe kind of a kleptocrat, and he's just doing sort of deals and functioning as the corrupt central European state, and to the extent to some degree laundering money in a sense, not that they need to launder their money, their governments, but just being a focal point for corruption. And that that's why Joe Biden and his team gravitated there, and there were some really tough deals done, and you could see the level of control and the comfort level Vice President Joe Biden had, because he's on television bragging. I turned and looked to him and said, if you don't fire the prosecutor, you don't get the $1 billion. Ha ha ha. I just told him
right,
what's
yeah,
what. That's not only is that unstatesmanlike to say something like that you strong armed another world leader, but again, it really seems people have often said, even if the deeper corruption can't be proven, what is that? How are you
yeah,
possibly getting another nation to fire a prosecutor, a special prosecutor, AG, whatever the individual was,
right.
one of their
Well,
government officials,
it's a
based
look.
on
It's
a
it's
pro-
a, it's a look at raw power. I mean, they're very braggadocious now about it. And so one of the things that I think Putin argues is that NATO, and we may go ahead and sort of expand that into saying it's beyond NATO. NATO represents something. It represents a strategy, and that strategy would be something that we've often heard about. We mentioned in our program yesterday, and I think it was 1984. When was it, 88 or something? It was George Bush Sr. Sorry if I'm getting my dates off that wrong, but he had referred to a new world order. I want to throw an image up here, and it has a quote from Putin. I'd like to get your reaction to it.
This is what destroys the existing world order.
So
And I
this
can't.
this
Mhm.
is Putin. He had a conference with Macron from France, and basically they were saber rattling. Macron was saying, "I'm not going to step back down. I'm not afraid of you," and Putin says, "Well, I don't think France wants a war with Russia." And you had some rather encouraging remarks about France yesterday.
I
Yeah,
don't
maybe I
think
meant
they do either.
disparaging instead of encouraging, but
Yeah.
I'll let you provide the narrative for those remarks. But in essence, he was saying, I don't think that France really wants to get involved. He's actually sent that signal to all nations, the UK and the United States included. So what do you think? Do you think the United States anticipated this? Do you think that France has been anticipating this? Do you think really anyone has sort of invested in some scenario of a war playing out here?
No, and that's kind of why I wanted to have this second broadcast, because we got into the details yesterday, but we didn't step back, and that's kind of what I find interesting. And again, we're not experts here. We've had our fill of experts, so we're just average guys trying to figure out what we see on the horizon, and be a little better at responding to it, because it does affect us. I mean, that's the interesting thing here, is that it will no doubt affect our economy, and it may affect us militarily. Who knows? But yeah, that's what's interesting to me, and I really spent the afternoon and the evening yesterday asking myself, what was the longer game plan here? And there's a possibility that there's this deep state in the U.S. I think there is, to a degree, however you decide to define that, and maybe in the rest of the world there's a series of elites, and it's quite possible that they sat back and they are even using this war. A lot of people have argued that a lot of information is coming out from John Durham in regard to the Russia Gate, people being indicted. A lot of information is coming out in regard to COVID and how it was
Mhm.
handled around the world and here in the United States, and that there's even arguments being made that perhaps the COVID deaths were overstated quite significantly. There was actually other reasons people passed away, and that the impact. I guess one article I saw in the UK, a gentleman did a study, and he said out of I think 167,000 COVID deaths reported in a certain year, it was really only 7,000 that were COVID only. That's a huge discrepancy. And he pointed out,
Yep.
yeah, on the other hand, he pointed out, looks like the number of people who had treatable cancers who were unable to, get into the hospital because of COVID related restrictions probably far exceeded 167,000 people dead because of these, untreated cancers, unscreened, untreated, whatnot. So he's pointing out that perhaps it's not just that, we overdid something a little bit, overreacted to an epidemic, but people are trying to say we made the entirely wrong decision and actually caused more death than we prevented. So these things are coming out now. A lot of people say, well, geez, this is a perfect time for a war for the Biden administration. I guess over in UK, they're defending their administration. And that makes sense to me. I've seen that kind of thing before. But I look at this, and I look particularly at the comment that Putin is making to Macron there, and I just think to myself, I have the sense here that the West was not ready for this. I have the sense here, and this is what my friend was arguing, that Ukraine was a nice little corrupt playground for bigwigs in the West to show up and sort of, do their dirty dealings, in the former Eastern Bloc. And this is why they didn't want them in the EU. This is why they didn't want them in NATO. This is, they were just too big, it was too important of a clearinghouse for corruption, in a sense, that they didn't want it taken away from them. And so all they wanted was a kind of, puppet government in there. And that Putin is looking at that saying that's exactly what I don't want. I mean, if anything, I'd like to go in there and organize things. And he runs a very strict social economy as well as his economic reality. There are things in Russia that he simply won't stand for, and some would argue that he's puritanical in some ways. I think they're anti-transgender, they're anti-homosexual. I don't think they have the kind of open and tolerant society that we see here in the West. And so there was a lot of praise for Ukraine. Oh, Ukraine is westernizing, it's westernizing. But my friend was pointing out that comes with its own issues. That all total freedom is not always that great. There need to be restrictions. You have to draw lines in the sand. So I actually feel like the West was completely unprepared for this. I think the anemic Biden response saying, okay, we're open for a minor incursion. Go ahead and take Luhansk and Donetsk. I think if I'm pronouncing this to northeastern republics that have declared independence. Go ahead and do that. We're not going to do anything about it. But I don't think in anyone's imagination. I think Brit Hume keeps saying this over and over on Fox News. Nobody expected to see, Russian tanks crossing, sort of the Polish plain, and Ukraine's kind of part of that larger northern plain that has access to Western Europe. I think they're reeling, and I think they may be overreacting. I think they may be destroying the Russian economy, and that's where I think Putin may not have expected that reaction. And I think, in a sense, everybody was asleep in a slumber. I mean, they were just sort of enjoying the newly connected global world where everybody kind of plays nice. We're stealing each other's technology, and we're sort of doing small sanctions. And Trump kind of upped the ante with some pretty big tariffs on China, and that rocked everyone's boat. But really, we all kind of play nice. And I think Putin's basically saying, no, I'm gonna rock the boat here and take the risk. And he can do that because he doesn't answer to his population.
So, we heard a quote, and it seems to keep resurfacing that that not tragedy, but there's events that you always want to take advantage or take an opportunity of.
No, I think it says, don't let a crisis go to waste.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. Don't let a good crisis go to waste, and especially on an international front. And so I'm just going to show you something that I looked at just prior to coming on the podcast with you, because in Desert Storm, one of the things that I saw was the commercialization of war. When I was on the battlefield, when we left from Saudi Arabia and went into Basra, went further into Iraq, the uniforms were being provided, as were many of the, explosives and detonation weapons, by France. And so, you'd see the crate right there. They were, buying their weapons from France and shipping them in. And so there's these strange bedfellows that are formed in these alliances that when wars occur. And but one thing was clear, that in Desert Storm, it was a clearinghouse for a lot of old equipment that, Storm Norman Schwarzkopf had as he had anticipated war, and particularly making that a theater, which means that you're going to be there for a long time. So, and we went back with, I think, Operation Enduring Freedom, and we were not long there in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, but we had been there for at least 10 years before. I mentioned it to you before, conducting sorties and bombing those areas and just pounding the ground continually. So when we went there, we had these tanks that had been storehoused out in the desert for a very long time. And this was a way for us to sort of, clear out all the old technology and make room for the new. You can see that sort of in Vietnam. There were some old classic pictures of these, helicopters being pushed off of the aircraft carriers, whatnot, making room for new inventory. And so, having said that, you can argue whether or not this was prepared or planned. I'm not going to try to take a position on it, but what I will say is who benefits, because you really have to always follow the money. And I'm going to tell you, this certainly hasn't hurt these folks. So here you see Raytheon Technologies, and you kind of see, and you're going to see a trend. I'm just going to show you 5 companies here, but you can see how their stock was kind of falling, and then all of a sudden they got a boost here. So, and this is Lockheed Martin Corporation, same thing. Look at this. I mean, they just jumped up, $125 billion market cap. Northrop Grumman Corporation, same thing, 73 billion. They're just trudging along, and then they get a nice pop. And General Dynamics, Corporation as well.
Doing okay.
Doing all right. And then our old friend, remember Dick Cheney and his Halliburton, company, right? So I took a little bit longer term view here, because they were, down here at around 20 and then bouncing around, but they really didn't get a significant spike in their market cap until right here about February, now March. You see them sort of singling new highs. So, there's whether or not they were anticipating this, whether or not there is a plan for it. Certainly we see a lot of companies that right now, when the Dow and the NASDAQ are just retracing to some, previous levels that we haven't seen in a long time, with oil rising to levels that we haven't seen in since Obama's administration. But it just can't. It's noteworthy, is all that I'm saying here. That these
that doesn't surprise me. I mean, what I see there is what would have surprised me, by the way, is if you would have seen sort of 6 months prior. you would have seen some of these stocks rising. That would have told you that somebody was in the know, that there were sales going on. But to see that they would rise now makes perfect sense to me, because this is a war that, as everyone points out, doesn't necessarily have to stop at the Ukraine. This could, this is every reason why NATO exists, is Russian aggression. And so the idea that the NATO nations, I wonder who's buying, right? Who's buying the weapons that's leading to that stock price increase? I mean, people are just anticipating, but I think it's the Western European nations who are stocking up. Now, maybe they're giving some of that to Ukraine. Maybe Ukraine's buying some of that directly, but you're absolutely right that war is a merchant operation. And everybody who's ever played Axis and Allies, I don't know how risk works exactly, but the money you spend in equipment is ultimately what decides, and how you place it is what decides who wins the game. And so there's no question in my mind that this is going to benefit a lot of people by having this war happen. What I can't understand.
Any chance that you think that Russia could be buying some really state-of-the-art new technology, U.S. technology from Afghanistan?
That would be sad to hear. I have no doubt that's the case. Apparently they're in control of Syria, right? And so their interest in the Middle East, they've sort of switched places with the U.S. in terms of what they're willing to commit to Middle East, issues. It's an interesting question of what they are and aren't, buying. I tend to sort of geek out a little bit on, weaponry and new technologies in that area. And, Russia is well known for, their research and development. They're no joke in that department.
Right.
And so they've got, big weapons and scary things that, in development that may or may not be operational. Who knows? Same thing with the Chinese. There's a lot of our generals who've been waving the flag saying, hey, we're getting outpaced by these guys, not just in spending, but in development. And, we may not be as dominant, a player militarily in the world as we once were. Again, seeing Ukraine fight Russia kind of, brings back kind of a sense of, wow, in terms of a conventional war, where they want to, preserve the value of the land, they seem to be, not doing as well as they would have originally hoped. But again, I'm thinking to myself that that's why these are the things that are leading me to say, maybe I'm misreading this. It's certainly easy to say, I'm sure, Putin would have liked to have had Kiev in his back pocket in 2 days, and Zelensky on a plane to the United States. And, that would have been very easy a program for him. And then he, could have, cleared out the rest of Ukraine and, said, hey, I've got, I've solved my Ukraine going into NATO problem. Right? Maybe I've solved my population problem. Maybe I've solved my warm water port problem. So, this turned out well for me for not much expense. But his resolve is pretty impressive. And again, the guy is super smart. Whatever you think about his morals, he's super smart. He's been in that position for a long time. If there's any place where, people are scheming to knock you out of your spot, it's got to be,
Right.
Russia has to be one of those places. So, to be in that position for as long as he has been means he's thinking, he's playing fifth level chess. He had to consider the situation where he didn't. I'm sure his generals said, we're going to have Kiev in 2 days, no problem. I'm sure he said, okay, but what if we don't? A leader like that always asks that difficult question. And he had to consider getting bogged down for a week or more. He had to consider that the Western nations might rally against him, as you point out, use the opportunity to shore up NATO, not just politically coming together closer with rhetoric, but also buying a bunch of weapons, which every government seems to want to do. He had to think there could even be a no-fly zone. There could be a direct attack, or counterattack or defense effort by the West. I'm sure he's even thought about his support from China. He's not the kind of guy to sit and say, well, the one thing I know is China's 100% in my corner no matter what happens, because he knows China's in his corner as long as it's in China's interest to be in his corner, and not a second longer. So I think he's had to have gamed out all of the possible scenarios. I read an article about 5 possible scenarios yesterday, and they're the ones you would suspect. But, ultimately, most people think that he has the staying power. He's going to ultimately take over Ukraine, barring a no-fly zone and barring a, very heroic, effort by the Ukrainians, which no one thinks ultimately they are going to be able to overcome his just the size and strength of his army. So he's got the staying power. So then what does that do to NATO?
Well, just, a news flash is just today I heard that Ukraine through Zelensky, has made application to join the European Union, and the European Union has accepted them. And I think that's probably a precursor
Oh,
to becoming part of NATO. You have to be part of the European Union. So that's a game changer. But I do think,
being accepted, that's shocking. I knew yesterday they had applied, but
yes,
being accepted, that is
because
really a game changer.
yeah, because that means that they can, expedite this as they will, because again, going back to the idea that there is this new world order that's trying to form, and Putin says that he stands against that. And as a result, he's being surrounded by NATO, which is effectively this new world order. And this guy, Hans Klaus, I think is his name, has openly talked about how he penetrates the cabinets of all these, different governments. And so, we've referred to it as I think it was Steve Bannon who called it the Davos Gang. We talked about the G7. It's had, different names, different iterative names throughout history. I'll stop with those. Those are the more contemporary ones. People may not be old enough to know what the older names were, but it's this sort of vanguard that they've been, that it is alleged that maybe business leaders or titans of industry have been trying to sort of dictate, the order of the world through policies and through sort of really making puppets out of the leaders. And you can see that with Trudeau in Canada. You can see it in many places. And a lot of times these leaders we know are put into power with the help of the CIA, Zelensky possibly one of them. But this could be just he's there for a purpose, and it's now served its purpose. NATO being able to, come in as with NATO forces, and we know that means with the U.S. funding and also U.S. troops, and then that would imperil, Putin's plan at this point. But I agree with you. And also, there's a gentleman named John Mersheimer who is an international, political historian and commentator. And he is redefining this as the new evil axis of powers, which includes Russia, China, as you mentioned, and Iran. So this is the alliance that Putin will fall back on, and
It's not that new, is it?
it's not that
At
new.
least,
This is the same as the
Russia
old.
and Iran.
Yeah.
That's interesting. And again, this, to me, I don't know. Maybe I lose count here, but is that a false flag operation? I mean, was this really, NATO or this group, as you're pointing out, the deep state, gang of Davos or whatever? Were they the ones saying, "Look, our world, we're not moving fast enough towards the unified approach that we want"? I think they want a singular unified approach, whether it's a one world government or ultimately they just want to have one world policy, which is almost being followed in the U.S. and the Western European countries,
Right.
Australia in that cabinet. There's a group of the Western world, I guess you'd call it, the free nations that aren't really that free anymore. They're really living under the dictates of many sort of this quote decided issues. I remember when Obama said, the debate on climate change has been had. Let's move on. And a lot of people said, "What? What did it?" And so it's easy to declare the debate over, and now we have to take action. So it's very interesting that you would point out that there was a lot of control governments had over their people when you had evil Russia, when you had the Soviet Union, hanging over everyone's head. When your kids are doing nuclear drills by, jumping under their school desks, which everyone knows is foolish. It's
Right.
like the masks. Today an article came out that said, the masks we all know didn't work, didn't do anything medically, but it was very important that we had them because it reminded people of the, devastating nature of the disease. And he just sat there and he said, "Well, hang on a second. We had everybody and their brother in masks, and the value of that was to remind us how serious the disease was. And now we're finding out the disease wasn't as serious as they told us." So, governments like to have, ill-defined, very scary threats that are constant and never go away.
Yeah.
And the problem is they've overplayed their climate change hand. And so what you find is that people are tired of hearing of climate change. They're just, I mean, when 10 years ago, people were saying that Florida was going to be underwater. Well, in 10 years, Well, it's 10 years later, and Florida's not underwater. As far as I know, every single beachfront condo there is just in the same place it used to be. Not that
Right.
there's not some minor beach erosion, but this idea that the sea was going to rise by 18 inches or whatever, and they showed all these computer generated maps,
Yeah.
just showed you how amazingly persuasive computer generated maps are. Technology is outpacing the human mind, so we
Yeah.
can make a couple of movies where you show the Statue of Liberty covered to the torch in a blizzard, makes people think, right? And tidal waves that wipe out Manhattan, and you get a sense that wow, this stuff's all incredibly real. I'm not saying some of it couldn't be real, but what I'm pointing out is there seems to be some desire to control populaces, and I think you're right. The ultimate idea, if Ukraine ends up in NATO, I mean that is one of the that was not in the five possible outcomes article. That's a shocker to me that they've let him in the EU. I
Mhm.
thought that was just a big stunt that they did. But if they've actually let them in and they're a member of the EU, that is now saying we can't allow Putin to win. Isn't that what that's saying?
It is, and just to sort of encapsulate everything that you've talked about, it's really just at the end of the day, it's a philosophical discussion, and one that Karl Marx began in his book, um, Das Kapital, and then the Communist Manifesto, actually, where he said that there was a specter, and the specter was hanging over Europe, and it was the specter of communism. And so, really, what the common thread is between this, axis of evil, if you will, especially China and Russia, is they share the same philosophy. And we've seen that philosophy coming in through the back door here in America for a very long time, but it's really made a very aggressive push here in just the last few years, all the way down now to the school system. So anyone who's listening to this podcast will immediately recognize what I'm saying, is that this philosophy that we fight against is it's a communist philosophy, and ultimately, in its final expression, is just basically a godless form of thought. And so you have that now being pushed, and in now I'm not sure, maybe you will know, I tried to look up what was the religious faith of Russia, and it seems to be some sort of Orthodox Christianity. But then I
Yes.
read a countervailing article that said that Christian missions aren't allowed to practice in that region. So I'm still not sure of what that is. I've always just thought of Russia as being communist and therefore atheistic, for just a better term.
No, I think you see St. Basil's Cathedral, which is right in Moscow. It's the most recognized landmark in Moscow. It's an Orthodox Christian church, and
Yeah.
so Orthodox Christianity, Greek, I think Orthodox is what they call it, maybe Eastern Orthodox as well.
Yeah.
Runs all the way up through that Eastern Bloc. I happen to be have friends in the Romanian Eastern Orthodox Church,
Mm.
and they're very. It's an interesting look at the difference between Western Christian faith and how it progressed versus Eastern Orthodoxy, because you would recognize a lot more of the Catholic Church in Eastern Orthodoxy, in the sense that there is a very strong hierarchy. There is a patriarch. You would, but at the same time, you would. There's a lot more focus on Bible reading than you saw in the Catholic Church, when they had the Bible in Latin and wasn't really available in the common tongue for people. So, in
Mm.
one sense, they have more structure than the Protestant Church that you would see in America, because they do have this authority that goes all the way to the top of the patriarch. At the same time, they're very much pushing doctrine out of the Bible. So you have much more of a sola scriptura kind of approach, which would be like the Protestants. So it's a very interesting crossover. But what's interesting, I read an article probably about 4 or 5 years ago talking about the resurgence of the Orthodox Christian faith post-Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union was certainly atheist and tried to stamp them out. And the interesting thing was they were pointing to these differences as the reason why it was so resilient. that the faith had not left. The people still, considered, their Christian leaders as part of the leadership, group in their lives.
Yeah.
And so when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was actually the Orthodox Church that was able to step up and provide a lot of the humanitarian aid and just general sort of community service that got Russia back on its feet again after a very, very difficult period of time. So, I wonder, I've often wondered, like these protests taking place, is the Orthodox Church somehow involved in that? I would assume they're anti-war. But
Mhm.
go back to the conversation you were stating earlier. I don't know if you wanted to go somewhere with that, with talking about the faith of the different people. I think, even if you step back from the language of anti-communism, which is the specter of communism, which I think is good language and fair language, is using their own description against them. But I look and I say there's just a general sense in the world that one man wants to control another. And communism is obviously the modern outgrowth of that. And it
Mhm.
really is, I like this word autocratic societies. I like that description because it's kind of, we're now seeing a muddling, so here, United States and Canada are free democracies,
Yeah.
but as you're pointing out, what, I mean, really? Are they? I mean, not the way we used to think about those. We certainly wouldn't say they're communist like China, right? We don't have a social credit score yet, but with vaccine passports, we sure made a stab at starting one, didn't we?
Yeah,
And so
I think you're saying autocratic, and then that perfectly aligns with technocratic as well, because it's the technology that's allowing this.
in
Autocracy.
fact, that's the key. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can't even the nice thing about the King of England, and his taxes was that you could still smuggle the booze, across the border to
Right.
France, right?
Yeah.
There was outs. There wasn't the technology to catch you,
Right.
But now with technology, there's we're going to lose any opportunity for any kind of black market or any kind of even in the world of ideas and speech, any ability to be an opposition thinker and an opposition, expressing the opposition. So, we'll be lucky if we have a loyal opposition, and that's what we have in many governments. A lot of people, asked where are the Republicans, shouting about the horses trampling people in the Freedom Convoy up there. You didn't hear a single Republican saying, "This is Canada. What are you doing, having the police with horses trample people who were, not resisting arrest?" And where is that? So I guess this is why I'm again, maybe taking a step back and listening to your position from yesterday, which is, let's take a reasonable, kind of completely open-minded evaluation. Maybe Putin isn't quite as bad an actor as we think. I think his approach and the methodology is certainly reprehensible,
Mhm.
but why is he doing what he's doing? And if the answer, my friend made the point, he's protecting and defending the quality of his culture, right? He doesn't want some of these Western cultural influences. China doesn't want some of these Western cultural influences. I have a lot in common. I'm a Christian, but I have a lot in common with people who are Muslims. When it comes to family values and how they want to defend their family and how they want to raise, their kids,
Mhm.
and they don't want to see filth on TV. I've had lots of Muslim friends. One of my coworkers sitting right next to me was a devout Muslim. We had wonderful conversations, and we spent a lot of time in each other's homes. And the homes were, wonderfully pure places where kids were, wouldn't have to hide the television from the kids. So there are influences that people would stand against, cross faiths, across religions, across even groups that are atheists who don't believe in any god at all. And I think you're finding that those groups are not finding a home really anywhere comfortably. And so I agree with you that, whether the specter of communism is now overlooking the whole world or whether it's just autocratic rule that's really, going to come to the fore, whether that comes as, pure communism or some kind of hybrid like we're seeing in Canada. How do you argue that Canada is not communist given what just happened? That they're going to invoke an emergency powers act because people are surrounding the Capitol, with barbecues and bouncy houses.
Yeah.
If you ask me, that's the most peaceful form of protest on the planet. People don't bring their kids. I think it
Yeah.
was.
Well, to your point, I mean, that is autocratic, but the technocratic part of it is that they were able to go into the bank accounts of the people that were funding the truckers, during the protest. And so those people that wanted to give through a GoFundMe page, or what, it started there, and then there were some alternatives that popped up.
Mm,
And so the prime minister kind of ordered the edict, And
Yep.
he said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to find out where this money is coming from. And if you're a Canadian citizen, he might as well have said, if you're a Canadian subject,
Yeah.
we're going to access your bank account. We'll freeze your bank account. And, I don't know how much they acted on that, or if it was just sort of a threat, but just the fact that it was spoken, it was enough to send, a chill down your spine. And I bet there's a lot of Canadians sort of reevaluating their citizenship as a result of that, because,
Or at least pulling their money out of the bank.
yeah, yeah. But, today it's because of the truckers, and tomorrow it's because, you want a free election. And, if it could quickly go downhill that fast. But it's the technology that's enabling it, that's allowing it. And so, but ultimately we're dealing with philosophies that we don't align ourselves with when we talk about Russia. But then again, we're talking from an age where we understood America as being, the place of liberty and freedom, and the First Amendment and Second Amendment were, never challenged. You might have some challenges on some of the others, but these were first and foremost. And it's why we were a beacon of light, and everybody came into our country. And, but things have changed so quickly, in the last 8 years, the last 4 years, the last year, because we've literally seen the deplatforming of the former president of the United States.
Unbelievable.
Right. And so through technology, they're able to do that. And we know that that's also something that in China that they were exploring. There were reports that came out that there were Chinese that were working at Google. So this is all reported in the mainstream media. And so they were helping, the Chinese were sort of helping Google understand some of these algorithms, that would remove people whose opinions and ideologies and ultimately their philosophies were not aligned, with that of the parties. And so, we're really in the throes, like you were referring to earlier. There's so much going on. It's kind of hard to recap it, but, because of what we're finding out about the insurrection, was it as the mainstream media would have you believe? About COVID, is it as the scientific community and the White House would have had us to have believed? What about what was going on with the Bidens, and why was Joe Biden's son in Ukraine? Why was
Biden there so often?
Such a flashpoint and a hot topic. And now this it's all bubbling up. Even Melinda Gates, I don't know if you saw that the other day, but she's divorcing Bill Gates. And she went on the mainstream media, had an interview, and said that she had met Jeffrey Epstein because she wanted to meet this person that Bill was spending so much time with. And, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is well known. They're buying up farmland all over the place, probably buying up water rights all over the place. And, Bill was heavily invested or influencing, the vaccines and, these studies.
These vaccination programs in Africa.
Yeah. And so here she is saying that she met Jeffrey Epstein once, and she said that it was being in the presence of pure evil. These are her words. And that she regretted ever meeting him. She's had nightmares ever since. And it's one of the reasons that she's divorcing Bill. But, all of this is kind of, I say that to say this, is that we know that there are people who have, bad intent. They're bad actors, and they have a philosophy that allows them to do it. And maybe this is sort of an expression of it that we're seeing play out in front of our very eyes, because it's hard to know, are we seeing a false flag? Are we seeing, agent provocateur, efforts? Or is this just, the natural course of actions of a world leader who, in the form of Russia, in Putin, is saying, look, here's the line and stop crossing it. And I'll stop at this comment. I heard Putin comment about Woodrow Wilson. One of his aides in 1918 had set out a very deliberate strategy back then to break up, he thought it would be better to break up the Russian, state, and to see it segmented, because it was too powerful as a unified front. And he also had commented that that's what they wanted to do with Europe. And one of Putin's critiques is that Europe has now been broken up into these, smaller, European Union members. And assimilated. So some of these countries no longer have their own currency. It's the European currency. That the UK is not one of them. They maintain their own, but that he says that that's what they want to do in Russia is break it up in order to weaken it. And he's quoting back to 1918. So, we wouldn't align ourselves with a communist philosophy, clearly. However, we are just arguing and are making the case that maybe there are some real reasons, and these aren't erratic behaviors. They are overburdening responses because we don't advocate for war in any sense, and the deaths, needless deaths of people, we condemn, unilaterally. But nonetheless, there is another reason for what's happening, and I think that's why we're having this conversation, to try to uncover and find out what it is. And we're very interested in the comments of anybody who's watching this. Please
Yeah,
correct.
that's it. Really, we want the comments and information of anybody watching, because that's what I've been trying to get at today, and I think you've articulated it well, which is that it does seem that something bigger is going on here, because it doesn't seem like the West thought he would actually invade at this level.
Mhm.
I think they had a sense that he might take a few republics here or there, just as he's done with Georgia and Crimea and other places where he's, moved forward, things that didn't really matter to us, didn't really matter even to the countries involved. People were pro-Russia, wanted him to be, in charge. And so, I think the surprise was the level at which he's done it. And again, I have to believe that he thought through those options, that might happen, that he might not move as quickly as possible. I think he shored up his eastern flank by doing a deal with China. I think that's really when they said, I think they had that recent meeting, him and Xi Jinping, and he I think came out and said something. It's a partnership on everything. Where it's
Mhm.
it's sort of an all items partnership. It's no restrictions. I think he may have been hinting at this. There was an article that came out and said China asked him to not invade Ukraine until after the Olympics. Again, I don't know the background for that. So yeah, as you were talking, I
Right.
thought about the technocratic aspect of this. And I remember that when they threw the Boston Tea Party folks threw the tea in the bay there,
Mhm.
I think the response of the British was to go and burn some farms. And so this tit for tat, control, people trying to rebel, and then people, trying to exert control over them, has been happening for centuries. But as you point out, with the technology the way it is today, and how dependent we are, and how deeply it's penetrated our daily lives, I would argue that it's not just that they have this massive ability to target, but it's the surgical strike that they can do that is so deadly here. And it's costless for them, right? And so Trudeau could merely get a list of names, and within minutes, those people's assets could be frozen, and that is frightening. Now that's totally different than we get a list of names, we go find out where their farm is, we take some horses, we get out there, they shoot at us, we try to burn their barn down. There's a lot more effort in burning a farm than there is in locking down a bank account. And so what we're seeing is that
Yeah.
the government, along with technology, who owes their existence to government and so is willing to do whatever, are able to really target people in a way that's punitive, it's quick, it's under the surface, it's not a big smoke cloud that draws the village who then says, who did this? The British, let's go attack the garrison. No, it's just Sally Jones, not being able to withdraw money from her ATM, going into a panic, and going to her mom's for dinner that night, wondering what she's going to do. And not really many people are drawn to that, to support that.
Mhm.
So the people are being separated and isolated, and they're subject to very surgical strikes. And then the governments are being protected and defended by technology and the media, and then they're in turn protecting and defending these technology and media giants so that nobody can challenge them. And I think it's fascinating, because it looks to me like the West didn't really think Putin would do what he's doing, at least not to
Mhm.
the level he's doing it. I don't think he thought they would react in the way they've reacted. But I agree with you, it would make sense to me that they would sit back, and in the deliberations they would say, you know what, I mean, since he's opened up the box, we do need to surround him. We do need to box him in. We could use an evil axis as a foil to be constantly working against.
Yeah.
I would argue that the pandemic, they attempted to use the pandemic as a way to control their populations, and
Yep.
I think they overplayed their hand. I think what's happening now is that the population got to the place in many countries where they're just over it. And so I think you're seeing mandates disappear kind of 2 weeks after the people said I'm not following the mandate anymore. They're not disappearing because they want to get rid of them or because the science says so. They're disappearing because no one's obeying them and it's too hard to enforce.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of add to something that you had said earlier is that, this is all a big distraction away from a number of things that would otherwise be media headlines. And so, because we're kind of coming, I think, about to the hour mark for the program, I'll leave you with my final thought, and then I'll let you have the last word there. But that, as this scenario is developing, you've said that Putin plays chess 5 levels deep. I agree with that. I think that he has, gamed this strategy out several layers. Maybe he didn't anticipate that Ukraine would be accepted into the European Union so quickly, or be able to anticipate, which we still have remains to be seen, that NATO is going to respond in kind and also very quickly, come and let them in, so that they can start to provide support and defense for Ukraine. But this could happen, very quickly. So if it does, you know, maybe Putin thought it out that far. Maybe he didn't. But if he did, then he would have had to have anticipated the nuclear option, because really conventional warfare is not it's not the ground game that it used to be. I mean, World War II is no longer the way that we fight wars. And literally, one of the main things that occurs to me as we're speaking here is that, the distance of Ukraine being the second largest landmass there in that area, what that represents, the really the the real gold in that is airspace, because you can't fly drones over the Ukrainian airspace, or any other kind of SR-71 technology or stealth technology that the Russians couldn't interdict. And so perhaps what's happening is that Putin is going to see that as a real threat if NATO forces come forward, and they already have, he's already claimed that missiles are going to come forward with it. He's asserted the nuclear option very early on. So the question would remain, if NATO does advance, would he go that way? And I think with China supporting him, and Iran, possibly he would feel emboldened by that. um, but he's also a politician. He also understands the backlash. He's media savvy. But that's the big question, and we'll be tuning in to hear what the mainstream media thinks about it as well. Your comments?
Well, I would just end with this: that it's interesting that you mentioned airspace. It's something we hadn't talked about earlier. Yeah, that, that's what we're doing here, right? We're casting about, saying what's the value of this? I mean,
Mhm.
people early on were saying, Ukraine, it's tiny, fairly unimportant nation, way off, near Russia somewhere, but it seems to be the chip that everybody wants. I mean, you've opened my eyes. I'm going to go do some research right now on this EU admission. If they've admitted him to EU, can you imagine Russia sort of occupying Sweden, or
Right.
occupying,
Yeah.
France, but they're part of the EU. So
Mexico. How
it
about
seems,
Mexico or
yeah,
Canada?
but it seems to me like the statement of letting them in the EU is basically saying we're not going to allow you to win, Putin. Because I've been sitting here thinking, when you look at the relative strength of the armies, that Putin's going to eventually win, and we're all going to be sitting here 6 months from now going, Zelensky put up a great fight, and we're proud of the Ukrainian people, but unfortunately Putin now controls that. The way nobody talks about Belarus as anything other than Russia. Right?
Right.
Nobody
Right.
really was complaining about the Crimea. Nobody, we just, life would go on.
Yeah.
But if you say that's an EU country and now Russia's occupying it, that's something different. So we'll see what NATO does, because again, it almost has to defend it at that point. But I was thinking this, something that I thought about when they started talking about SWIFT that popped into my mind, and I'll end with this. is I thought, wow, I wonder if that's going too far, the financial nuclear option, because Russia and China have already indicated that they're willing to step up and create a different reserve currency for the world.
Hmm.
And striking down the dollar as a reserve currency would have a dramatic, effect on the United States economy and on our power in the world. Um, it'd be a really big blow. And when you look at our own leaders who really don't want to, agree with American exceptionalism or don't really support America as the light of the world, just think we're just another nation, as Obama said. Um, they would be okay that we would no longer have the reserve currency. And so what I thought was, wow, if you pull that SWIFT lever and you shut them out of banking transactions,
Yeah.
it makes every reason for them, for China. You have just justified China and Russia saying, you know what, we have to do our own reserve currency. We're going to have Iran and North Korea and Venezuela, and who else is going to join us? And
Yeah.
you might see, Argentina, all of your debts can be forgiven. Just join this new reserve currency. Let's have a total reset. And what would happen? Maybe you have the world split in two. The dollar is a reserve currency of one area, and then what happens when the EU says, "Well, hang on. Now you're not the biggest kid on the block. You're kind of equal to us. So we want to have the euro be the reserve currency." And so we've opened up, a can of worms here that's not going to be easily closed. And that's why I don't think either side was prepared for it to go this far. I think the Western powers have been so focused on their unified government climate control agenda that they were hoping he'd take a few, provinces, we could sell a few weapons, we could rattle our swords, and then we could go right back. As John Kerry said, I hope Putin would remember, the climate in all this. That was his first speech, right when the whole thing broke out. Wow, really? People are dying, and you want to make sure Putin remembers the climate. And so I think Russia and China might be making a play here. And so what's interesting to me is I think all of it comes down to where China chooses to land.
Yeah.
And I think we'll get a signal of that real quick based on what they decide to do with Taiwan. Because if they go for Taiwan, what they're saying is, I've seen enough that I feel confident that the Western powers couldn't stop Russia, so they can't stop me. And I've joined up with my big neighbor here. We're both nuclear powers, and I'm going to use Russia the way Germany used Italy, and Japan was trying to use Germany and Italy, and vice versa.
Hmm.
We'll team up. Bad people doing bad things for a while, and then when I wipe out the rest of the world and control it, then I'll turn on my neighbor. Stalin wanted to do that with Hitler and whatnot. So I think we're seeing that in a sense. Perhaps we pushed China and Russia, historically horrible enemies, to become bedfellows for the time being. And that could be really bad for the Western world. And particularly when you think about how much debt we've piled up, how much we've
Hmm.
addicted ourselves to materialism,
Right.
how weak we've become. I mean, we are not the World War II generation. Those were a bunch of farm boys and factory workers and farm gals and, factory working, Rosie, Riveter, these were hardworking people who could put up, who didn't expect a lot, put up with long hours and hard labor. That's not our population today. That's not me. I like to have
Right.
my nice latte, the way I want it, and I get upset if there's not enough, almond milk. And so, that's not the populations of Russia and China. It's
Yeah.
not the populations of Russia and China and Ukraine now. And so I think this is why I wanted to have the second broadcast, but I think there's so much more at stake here. And I wonder if people are really sussing it out and thinking about what the world looks like if Russia either takes Ukraine, as everybody expects is kind of going to happen,
Hmm.
or what does it look like if the EU says, no, we're not going to let it happen. And no matter how much territory you've taken, we're going to drive you out. Wow. Will people use the nuclear option? I mean, in my mind, that's such an incredibly devastating reality. I mean, if China, Russia, and the United States and other countries start firing intercontinental ballistic missiles, I think at that point, news analysis is irrelevant. I mean, everyone's, if you're lucky, you're hiding in a cave and dying of radiation poisoning. So I think that's a level of destruction that probably people won't push to. I always worry more about the independent nuclear actor like Iran or somebody who just lights off a nuke.
Hmm.
Um, so, I think Putin's saber rattling there. I think, they will rattle back and China will get involved, but I don't think anyone's going to do that. I think people want the chessboard to be usable when they're done. But
Yeah.
would China and Russia decide to bifurcate the world and be comfortable with that? Maybe, maybe. Especially, by the way, this will be my last comment. Especially if you can attack your neighbor, get sanctioned, have the whole world hate you and call you immoral, but they still buy 500,000 barrels a day of oil from you.
Exactly. And, I'll join in on that because, what really matters ultimately when you bring it back to America and people who would have endured the podcast to the very end, to make it relevant to you, we'll see you at the gas pump. Crude is $120 a barrel, and we're seeing higher prices than we've seen in so many years. And so I think that if war continues, even in the European theater and Ukraine with Russia, it's ultimately going to have an impact on what we pay for gas. And as Americans, it's one of the things that hits us in the pocket, the fastest and the deepest. So hopefully, we'll see things move quickly, and we have a weekend that we're going into. But I'll look forward to the other side of the week, and hopefully picking this up again Monday or Tuesday with you. And so
this has been fun, Dave. Thanks a lot.
All right, Eric. Thanks. Let me take us out here. And we'll see you next week.
See you next week.